the answer that is sometimes given to the question, do we as humans have a purpose? The response is no, we're just a kind of organized bag of molecules that has been shaped by historical processes. That picture sort of doesn't take seriously just how significant the organizational structure that we exhibit is. So when somebody asks me, is purpose real? I want to have them sit down, get a cup of coffee, and say, we need to have a longer conversation. My name is Alan Love. I am a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. I'm also the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. I spend most of my time looking at how biologists think about their subject matter and how, when they work together across disciplinary lines, there might be interesting synergy and interesting friction between them.
Part 1. The Science of Purpose. Chapter 1. The Censored Language.
So the word teleology is the study of purposes or goals. So telos from the Greek for goal. And so anytime that somebody is talking about, how do organisms accomplish certain functions, they are broadly in the space of teleology. So in everyday language, we commonly talk about teeth being for chewing, eyes for seeing. But in biology, that sort of language is tied up with a history of worrying about whether or not something illicit is being invoked when you make that claim. And in part, that's because in the history of biology, there have been claims that those sorts of phrasings about teeth being for chewing or eyes being for seeing somehow implies that something designed those things for those purposes. And so as evolutionary biology developed through the 19th century and mechanistic approaches continued to develop through the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, a lot of biologists tended to avoid that locution because they didn't want it to be the case that they were somehow illicitly implying that sort of problematic inference to design. At the same time, there was a recognition that this language is natural for talking about biology, in some sense appropriate for describing what's going on, and therefore a kind of tension emerges about how do you avoid a language that is somehow natural for what you're trying to describe. And that is probably where we sort of locate a lot of the 20th century, where talk of purpose and teleology is usually censored because it's thought to have those untoward kind of implications. I think what we now see better, maybe with a little bit of hindsight, is that there's a lot more complexity to what counts as teleology than maybe what was spurned or rejected as having those design or religion-oriented associations. And that, in fact, in order to tease apart some of that complexity, we have to engage with it much more directly instead of simply tiptoeing around it or avoiding it. What we are seeing now and in more recent history is that there is very good justification for the use of that language, and it can be grounded philosophically in a number of different approaches that are epistemologically quite valid and don't have those problematic assumptions behind them. And so that's one of the main motivations behind the Science of Purpose initiative and in my own efforts specifically, where we're trying to bring together philosophers and scientists who are interested in these kinds of questions about goal-directed behavior, purposiveness, directionality, agency in living systems, and figure out ways to conceptualize them and make them tractable for experimentation, data collection, and rigorous theorizing.
Chapter 2, The Broken Wing Display.
So if we're looking to biology for a kind of easy to understand example of teleology, probably one of the best examples is one that's been known for more than 2,000 years, which is the broken wing display that some birds exhibit. Many of us might be familiar with this, having watched videos or even maybe observed the behavior where a bird who has a nest identifies that a predator is in the vicinity, and because there are either eggs or chicks in the nest, the adult bird engages in a display of seemingly having a broken wing. And as they engage in that behavior, they move further away from the nest in an effort to attract the predator towards them rather than to the offspring in the nest. Now, of course, what is quite interesting about this is that the bird is certainly engaging in the broken wing display for a purpose. It is trying to pull the predator away from the nest. That is the goal of the behavior, and the behavior is successful to the degree to which the predator does not discover the nest. So the question then is, this behavior, how did it get there? How do we get to a place where a bird recognizes that it has to engage in a behavior that deceives the predator into moving away from the location of the nest? When we start thinking about that, we can ask pretty natural questions like, okay, well, how does the broken wing behavior happen? What are its triggers? How does the bird know when to do it? How does the mechanics of the wing display even operate to make it look like the bird can't fly and is therefore vulnerable to the predator? And if we kind of step back from that array of questions, what we get is two kind of broad, purposive questions that are in the space of teleology. One, what is the trait for? All right, which is maybe the most natural one, because we might ask the same question about the eye or teeth. But we also can ask, what does it take for a system to be able to engage in those kinds of behaviors? It seems like a broken wing display is something an organism does. It is something that a living system is somehow especially capable of doing. And so the biologist can dive in on either of those questions, but once they do, they are in this space that has been recognized since Greek antiquity of trying to understand the nature of purposiveness in living systems and what it's constituted by. So in contemplating the broken wing behavior that we see in birds, one question that we naturally ask is, what is the function of that behavior? But another question that I think is equally important is, what is it for a system to be able to engage in those kinds of behaviors? And when we ask that second question, we are getting into the space of what counts as life. What is it to be alive? What exactly is life? What is it to be alive? And is it somehow involve exactly these kinds of capacities?
Chapter 3, Agency, Directionality, and Function.
Agency, directionality, and function all are concepts that swirl around this large space of purpose in biology. So we can maybe break them down one by one. Agency refers to the capacity of organisms to self-maintain and select behavioral options from among sets of choices available to them in order to pursue their goals, such as reproduction or foraging. So we're all familiar with earthworms. They crawl through the soil and make it possible for that soil to be used for lots of our human endeavors. But in fact, when those earthworms are moving through the soil and consuming it and defecating it and churning it up more generally, they are actually creating an environment that is more conducive to their continued existence. That behavior is usually referred to as niche construction, where the organism is in some way constructing or building its own environment. And the important thing is that environment is inherited and passed on beyond the life of the individual organism and thereby can have that longer term effect. Then we can start to see how there's this direct impact between thinking about an earthworm simply moving through the soil and long-term consequences for, say, the evolutionary process and how it shapes new functions and helps us better see that the small and the mundane organismal decisions are actually having potentially broad consequences for the history of life. The question that is interesting about agency in the space of biology is to what degree is the capacity of agency somehow explained away if we attend to, say, lower level systems, maybe especially the nervous system and the brain in animals, to understand how an organism could have that agency. And is it the case that the very idea of agency somehow evaporates once you pay attention to those lower level systems? Historically, I think we can see even some biologists willing to countenance the possibility that organisms are glorified robots, simply responding to the stimuli in their environment based on historically conditioned instincts. And that view has been popular at different times in the past, but I'd say it's exactly that view that a lot of contemporary biology is not as happy with or comfortable with anymore in thinking about the organism as a genuine agent. Directionality, the second concept, has to do with what kinds of empirical behavior do we only expect of living systems. So when we look at an organism like a squirrel sort of moving around in trees or on the ground, right, we think that that movement has a certain directionality that's associated with the organism having goals or aims of some kind, say collecting food. When we think about the directionality of a ball rolling down a hill, we don't think that that's the same kind of directionality. The last concept, function, refers to what we think of as basic for organisms needing to do things. An organism needs to eat, an organism needs to mate, so there are associated traits that allow those things to happen appropriately. So we oftentimes attribute function to the traits that, say, allow an organism to eat, allow an organism to mate. And the question then is, how did those functions arise? Because we know from looking across the tree of life that the nature of those functions is not uniform, that whales eat very differently than squirrels, and mating behavior is very different across the animal kingdom. And how is it that we get new forms of functionality? How is it that one function changes into another? Or even how is it that one trait can exhibit more than one function at a time? So that, I think, sort of gives a broad viewpoint of those three core concepts, and maybe just to sort of tie them all together, what makes it interesting and also potentially controversial is whether or not when we pay close attention to agency, directionality, or function, we end up seeing biological processes and evolution in a different way than before. And so the implications are potentially quite powerful if the way we think about those concepts actually changes the way we theorize and do data gathering in biological investigation.
Part 2, Purpose in the Wild. Chapter 1, Cells Gone Rogue.
The example of the broken wing display in birds and other common examples like eyes for seeing, teeth for chewing, might seem like they are far away from our everyday experience. Maybe the zoologist is interested in those things, the ornithologist wants to study the birds and understand them. But what does that mean for us on an everyday basis? Well, we bump into some of these same issues of teleology or purpose in a variety of ways in our everyday life, perhaps most poignantly with respect to disease. So if we take cancer as a disease that involves uncontrolled growth and proliferation of cells that eventually metastasize and spread throughout the body, causing pain and death, in some respects what's going on is that those cells are taking on a kind of independent agency that is distinct from the whole organism. They've gone rogue in some respects. And so, well, if they are doing that, is that what they're supposed to be doing? Well, most of modern medicine would say, no, those cells are not supposed to be engaging in uncontrolled growth and proliferation. And then we want to understand, well, why do they do that? Is it because they somehow have lost the context of control for what they're supposed to be doing? But if they're supposed to be doing something, then that's their true purpose, and they've somehow lost it or left it behind. So in an example like cancer, we start to see that questions of goal-directed behavior and agency pop up quite readily in the context of something that affects many of us at different points in our lives. So in describing cancer as cells gone rogue, it's certainly the case that we are sort of utilizing a behavioral metaphor that attributes a certain kind of agency to those cells. At the same time, the biology of cancer is about doing something sort of that the system is not supposed to be doing. And so in that respect, calling out the behavior of cancerous cells as rogue is entirely appropriate. Now, to say that is not the same thing as to explain it. And so certainly the label is only the beginning. But what is certainly going on, and many have pointed out, that the individual cell started with a capacity to have its own behavior and agency, and is now a part of a multicellular entity that suppresses, in some respects, the individual agency of that cell for the sort of greater good of the whole multicellular organism. So if we are approaching cancer from that perspective, we can then ask, to what degree is the behavior of cancer something like recovering for the individual cell a capacity that it once had and exercised and wasn't doing so primarily until the cancer began. And we can then better understand how the cells go rogue by better understanding what it was like for them to have individual agency in the first place. And I think that's where the insight can come from thinking about the system that way. Now, that does not deny that we would want to understand the mutations that occur and the way in which there might be chromosomal modifications and other features of cancer. Those are all complementary dimensions of investigation. But the point is that at a very basic level, the phenomenon that we are observing in cancer is a cell doing something where its own interest is primary rather than the interest of the larger multicellular context that it was embedded in. So it definitely can be a potential game changer for cancer treatments if we think about agency more so, because what we then concentrate attention on is how to address that capacity, how to, in the case of those cells that have gone rogue, suppressing or turning off that capacity in the first place. And that's a very different strategy than simply killing the cells, which we might think of as the primary strategy for chemotherapy, or removing the cells in terms of surgery. And in fact, many of the more recent treatments that try to leverage our immune system, right, effectively suppress that agency through a kind of internal policing, whereby the cancer is recognized as no longer part of the system and therefore needing to be removed. In a similar sort of analogy to how we think about human societies, this is an individual that needs to somehow be quarantined or removed because they have gone outside of the bounds of some rule or structure, and that when we go after that individual, we want to do so in such a way that is the most effective. Another potential application of thinking about the teleology of the organism as agent in the context of medicine is the placebo effect. So we now have good evidence that the way a patient thinks about or assumes they are being treated in the context of, say, a randomized controlled trial can make a difference to their outcome. And the precise mechanisms behind placebos are still being worked out. But what they highlight is that, in fact, the organism and the capacities that sustain its sort of agential awareness are things that feed back onto the health of the organism. And that if we can understand those agential capacities better, we might actually be able to harness the placebo effect more directly into medicine, allowing us to arguably do something that medicine has wanted to do for a very long time, which is harness the capacity of the mind to heal the body.
Chapter 2, Collective Agency, Ants, Wolves, and Military Units.
The case of ants collaborating together to build a bridge of themselves across some gap is an amazing example of what is sometimes referred to as collective agency, where multiple organisms work together toward some common goal. And in the case of those ants, as in other cases as well, it is hard for us to understand what's going on, because it would seem that individuals within that collective might end up suffering, or in some sense having some fitness cost for building out that bridge, or more broadly being engaged in collective agency. There's some sacrifices being made on the part of an individual for the group. So in the theoretical modeling, as well as in particular empirical case studies, biologists are particularly interested in what are the conditions under which that kind of collective agency takes place. Because we know not all organisms engage in that kind of collective behavior. Some organisms are quite solitary. and don't spend time with their conspecifics? What are the conditions under which organisms seemingly collaborate on these larger scale projects that include not just building bridges, but also constructing, say, termite mounds and other sorts of nest architectures that will long outlive any individual member of the nest? How is it that you can get this sort of laboring towards a larger goal that any one individual themselves doesn't necessarily have an image of or a representation of what that goal is? And that's a huge challenge and a really interesting one. But again, we have to sort of grab onto that phenomenon as interestingly complex in order to start making progress on those conditions for collective agency. So if we compare a wolf pack hunting together to, say, a military unit that is carrying out some set of orders, there are going to be a variety of similarities and differences. Similarities certainly will include the way in which multiple organisms are co-laboring towards some common goal. However, in terms of differences, the way that coordination takes place is different. There's linguistic coordination in the case of the military unit that is not there in the case of the wolf pack. But when we're talking about how does a system engage in collaborative behavior toward a common goal, I think the overlapping similarities between the two examples are quite striking and clear.
Chapter 3: AI and the Limits of Agency.
So the context of artificial intelligence or AI in thinking about purposiveness, goal-directed behavior, agency is really exploding, and something that I think of as super exciting because we're seeing so much happen so fast that our sort of capacity to do has outstripped our capacity to understand in many circumstances. AI platforms are sometimes referred to, or their components are referred to as agents. And so it's very interesting to think, well, is an AI agent similar in the relevant respects to a biological organism agent? And on what basis do we make the comparison? And I think right now we tend to want to affirm their agential status, in part because the AI systems seem to be able to do things that we can do, reasoning tasks, problem solving of different kinds. Whereas in thinking about them as potentially being different, we recognize that the way they carry out their tasks, the way they solve their problems, may actually be different from the way we do so, or the way our biological wetware implements things. So I do think that biology and AI investigations can be mutually informative. For AI, there can be a healthy amount of learning from how biological systems are set up and what kinds of principles they're set up on, and whether those principles confer certain kinds of abilities or capacities on systems that we want our AI platforms to engage in. At the same time, because AI systems are artificial and we can manipulate them and tinker with them in profound ways, we can learn lessons about the sort of breaking points and possibility space for living organisms exhibiting some of those capacities that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do because we couldn't experimentally modify living systems with that kind of precision. And therefore, we can learn things for biology from AI. So I do think that it is a two-way street between the two. However, we're in early days of that endeavor. And so I would expect over the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to see a sort of explosion of studies that explore exactly those two kinds of pathways. Another interesting connection between AI agents and organismal agents is to what degree can we fool ourselves about what's going on. In the traditional discussion about teleology in biology, many biologists have worried that we tend to anthropomorphize or attribute capacities to biological systems that they actually don't have and don't need in order to carry out certain kinds of tasks. At the same time, we can see something similar in AI, where a lot of people are potentially overinterpreting what's going on with an AI agent, claiming that a platform thinks, or in some sense even feels, when in fact that sort of interpretation is not warranted or necessitated by the data available. So in that respect, AI and biology together in the space of teleology kind of remind us of the need to be careful and rigorous in how we approach them.
Part 3. How Science Gets Unmade. Chapter 1. The Siloing of Science.
When we approach the sort of modern landscape of disciplines in academic spaces, we tend to think, isn't this the natural way for things to be? But in fact, they are of relatively recent invention, in that most of the architecture that we experience, say, in a modern university context, arose in the 19th century. For most of organized human history, when people were interested in questions, they studied them, but did not necessarily have sharp boundaries about who was allowed to study them or whether you could ask only one kind of question rather than another about, say, the planets or medicine or the behavior of light or something like that. So what happens in the 18th and 19th century in particular is that the community of investigators grows in size. For most of history, the people involved was just a very small number. And as the community gets larger, we need some form of organization. And that form of organization starts to fall out along lines of interest that people have in different kinds of phenomena. So the chemists that we think about are interested in chemistry, and we see chemistry emerge as a space, or physics as a space, and different areas of physics, so the study of optics or the study of planetary motion. And into the 20th century, that structure starts to also solidify for the humanities and social sciences. And philosophy isn't a discipline until the late 19th, early 20th century. The origin of the American Philosophical Association is actually 1895. So this structure is very good for making it possible for large groups of people to be coordinated in spaces to do this kind of research, to have conferences where they can meet up and talk to one another about the progress that they've made, for them to have journals that they can publish their research in, and make sure that other people know what they're doing. However, over time, that leads to people being relatively separated from one another and not spending as much time talking what might be thought of as more broadly, across boundaries, or in ways where we might see creative combinations emerge. And thus, it's perhaps not surprising that, especially in biology, there is deep interest in cross-disciplinary work because the organism exhibits multiple disciplines in its very architecture, whether it's the physics of the embryo or it's the physiology of the temperature regulation in the body, or whether it's the movement of cells in the circulation of the bloodstream. Organisms on their own, in their spatial and temporal scales, cover multiple disciplines. So when we come to think about how best to prosecute research in biology, although it's certainly been productive that it was organized along disciplinary lines, certain kinds of questions that involve crossing those lines tend not to get asked. And therefore, my initiative in trying to organize work, especially in the space surrounding teleology, is to find ways to let those boundaries be relaxed and let people be able to range more widely and interact more broadly so that they might build new collaborations with people around problems that no longer can be confined to those disciplinary spaces. Most of the individuals working in what we would now call science, they would have called natural philosophy, definitely moved easily across boundaries. Isaac Newton worked on everything from optics and chemistry to some of the standard physics that we think about, as well as thinking about how they apply to living systems. Individuals like Darwin also had that capacity. He actively consumed in his reading economic literature, literature from culture and anthropology and aesthetics to develop his own thinking. So these individuals, I think, had a much wider range that they took in when they were developing their own thought and saw themselves as working on a wider range of problems maybe than a contemporary scientist might. However, at the same time, we have to recognize that those individuals in the past had a certain freedom to do what they did because of their privilege, right? Because they were independently wealthy, because they had an established position within a university network or a place that gave them the resources to do those things. And so one of the important transformations of the 19th and 20th century is that science is now something that can be pursued by a much wider range of people than was possible beforehand. That you can do science as a career. You can make a living. You don't have to come from independent wealth in order to pursue these questions. However, it still takes money to do science. You still need grants. You still need to be able to run your experiments and do your field work. And so it's absolutely critical that we think actively about how the science is funded, and especially science that falls outside of some of the standard funding mechanisms, which have been primarily organized around disciplinary structures that are more common. Thinking about how the landscape of science might change if we lost some of the rigidity of disciplinary structure is a exercise in imagination that probably could go in different directions for different people. One would be that teaching would change. We would no longer be taught a kind of introductory sequence within a discipline, but rather would have ways in which co-teaching arrangements were more common and students were exposed to a wider range of material together rather than kind of packaged separately. So ultimately, I would expect that a transformed landscape of science and philosophical inquiry is going to be one in which teaching and research look very different than they do today.
Chapter 2, The Vienna Circle and Beyond.
As director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, I'm very aware of the heritage of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. It began in 1953 under the leadership of Herbert Feigl. And Herbert Feigl had come to the United States in the early 1930s from Vienna. And when he had been a doctoral student in Vienna in philosophy, he had been engaged in regular conversations and helped organize a group called the Vienna Circle. And the Vienna Circle was an interdisciplinary group of mathematicians, scientists, and philosophers who met regularly to engage in problems that crossed disciplinary boundaries. So today, I see myself as inheriting that legacy, finding ways to both maintain it as well as augment it in the contemporary university of the 21st century. And that includes actively building relationships across different sciences in ways that might even run counter to the university administration expectations, that we are doing activities that push people into common spaces where they might not otherwise have been. I am utterly amazed about how much we don't know, how much we discover new things and yet never exhaust those discoveries. I'm an avid reader of the sort of latest in the sciences because I am always stimulated to see what went beyond our imagination, what fossil was discovered that we weren't necessarily expecting, what feature of the cell that previously was not understood is now understood. I am excited about every level of organization spatially and all the temporal scales that biology encompasses from the day-to-day to the history of life. And that gets me out of bed in the morning and makes me excited to be involved in helping research take place on this ever-expanding frontier.